I come from a family of drivers, but this doesn't mean we were all good drivers. My mother, for example, took 5 grueling attempts before she got her license, after which she immediately began getting into accidents. She hit trees, she hit ravines, she hit our other cars. She never hit anybody else. Once she actually flipped her car over. This was interesting because my dad and I were actually driving nearby when it happened. I guess we should be glad she didn't hit us. All I remember is my dad going, "I think that's your mother." And my response was, "Why are you so nosy," right? Like, total embarrassed child of immigrants. Like, I didn't even want to look in the direction of the accident. Eventually, my dad's like, "That is your mother. Like, how can I not recognize my own mother?" So we get over there, and like, traffic is whipping her long Indian mom braid, and behind her, wedged against the median, is our Datsun station wagon, upside down on its roof, one tire still spinning. Now, this did not mean my mom drove any less afterwards. We all drove constantly. My brother and I drove years before we had our licenses. My dad took us on unnaturally long road trips. Once we showed up in California at Universal Studios dressed in our Sunday church clothes for some reason. This was akin to me back then to showing up at church wearing hockey face masks. Like, it was so embarrassing to me. And embarrassment was a huge part of my childhood, as were cars. In fact, they sort of went hand in hand. For example, one of my biggest fears was being late to school and needing my dad to drop me off. I mean, we still drove the Datsun after my mom flipped it on its roof. And this embarrassment was really complicated for me because I didn't want to be embarrassed of my dad, but I also knew how unbelievably poor our cars made us look. And my dad knew this too. So when my brother turned 16, he decided to rectify this by buying a brand new, very stock, Chevy S10 Blazer. Now, we had no need for an SUV or even a car at this point, but my dad knew the very American trope of turning 16, getting your license, and having something cool to drive. And this gas-guzzling Chevy, it was like driving an American flag, right? Like, it was not your auntie's Toyota Camry, right? So my dad bought it, he financed it even though he couldn't afford it, and we all loved this car. We loved the pizza cutter tires. We didn't care that the speedometer only went up to 80 miles per hour, and my dad just loved giving the Blazer to my brother. Now, of course, the Blazer was just a proxy. What my dad really wanted to give my brother was a green card. And this was because he knew how hard it would be for my brother to get a job without one. My dad, at the time, he only had a work permit, so he had to hold 2 full-time jobs simultaneously. So he was a typist from 9 to 5, and then he worked the night shift at Holiday Inn. And he did this 5 days a week. So my entire childhood, I remember my dad coming home from a full day of work, and he would make some really delicious, weird dinner like hot dog curry, and then he would sleep for a few hours and wake up at 10. He'd put on this really hideous green Kelly green blazer, and he would go to work all night, and he would come back at 7 o'clock in the morning when we were all getting ready for school and do it all over again. And he did this Monday through Friday. And on weekends, he fixed cars for extra money. So he was constantly working. He was always exhausted. Like, if you didn't talk to him for 7 or 8 minutes in a row, he would fall asleep no matter what he was doing. He was just always tired. And he did this because he wanted my brother and I to be American. He wanted us to have the American dream. And 2 years after we got the Blazer, he actually got a chance to make my brother American because Congress passed the 1990 Immigration Act. And one of the things the act stipulated was that immigrants could expedite their naturalization process by exiting the US and resubmitting their paperwork from their home country. So this meant my mom, my dad, and my brother could leave the US and restart their applications from India, and they would become citizens faster. So for my dad, there was no question we would go. Like, my brother was in college at this time, like he was gonna need a job soon, so we were definitely gonna do this. How we were going to pay for a transcontinental voyage for 4 people, my dad had no idea. And of course, he immediately regretted buying the Blazer. The car note had always been a burden, but now it was like an albatross, right? Like he'd always said, if anything happened, if the basement flooded or the fridge broke, we would be screwed. And now he was being asked to come up with thousands upon thousands of dollars, and he just felt like it couldn't get any worse. Of course, it got worse. A few weeks after we heard about the Immigration Act, we started planning this trip. My dad got fired from Holiday Inn. And this was because you could smoke on your break, you could eat on your break, you could talk on the phone on your break, but you could not accidentally fall asleep upright in a chair on your break. Now, what I remember most about this time period is not how we actually made it to India. My dad conducting credit card acrobatics from which he would never financially recover, the stress of which actually cost him his hair. What I remember is being back at the Chevy dealership 2 years prior. I remember my dad pacing the showroom floor. I remember him calling up uncles on the phone for advice. I remember one uncle saying, "The gas mileage alone is a reason not to buy it," right? And there were no reasons to buy it, yet there it beckoned from the parking lot within reach. And what was within reach, of course, was the American dream for his kids, right? The Blazer said that we belonged. It said that we were Americans. So my dad signed the papers, and as he was starting to sign the papers, I actually started to panic. I started to freak out. Like, who did we think we were? The Jeffersons? The Huxtables? We were gonna drive home in that gleaming white American truck? Like, it felt too good to be true, right? I couldn't take it, and I started crying, and I yelled out to my dad. I said, Uppa, don't do it. What if something happens? The basement, the fridge, like the roof, what if something happens? And of course, my dad had no idea that something would happen, that he would lose half his income while simultaneously being asked to come up with half of his income. He had no idea that we would come to the edge of financial ruin. He only knew that he wanted my brother and I to have things like the Blazer, things like America. So when through my tears I shouted at him, Uppa, what if something happens? He handed the keys to my brother and he said, what could happen? What happened was a few years later they all became citizens, and my mom, who had always been banned from driving the Blazer, snuck out to drive it and promptly crashed it. Thank you.